It was supposed to be magazines. When Elaine called me to let me know she was cleaning out an office in New York City, she said, "I have some magazines you might be interested in. They're periodicals from the 1960s to the 1990s and dealing with office culture." Well, naturally, I thought this would be great, and I told her I'll even come down and pick them up myself. So that's how I found myself driving down to New York City, down to Fulton Street, near the World Trade Center, to pick up what I thought would be 5 or 10 banker boxes worth of magazines. Elaine said to me, "Hey, if there's any chance you could park, it would be probably good for you to see if there was anything else in this office you might want." I said, "Sure." And when she brought me upstairs, and I looked around, and she described to me what we were seeing, I got to say something I don't get to say all that often. I am not consulting my superiors, and I'm going to tell you, we'll take everything in this room. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting myself out of debt. Thanks to Daniel Boyd, Peter Healy, and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. I have to stress that when I took that elevator ride with Elaine, I had no idea what I was walking into, any of the context of what had been there, or, frankly, any context whatsoever. I'm pretty used to walking into attics and houses and offices and being told the stuff is over in the corner. You can take any of it that you want, and if I was lucky, somebody might even help me lift it out to the car. In this case, she took me into an office that was a really strange combination of old school New York and some sort of research library. There were floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with books and folios and typewriters, and it felt like it had been here for a very long time. She walked me over to a collection of magazines and said, "Well, this is what I was talking about." And then I asked her, "What else is here?" And here's what she explained to me. She had been a protege to a fellow named Peter Tytell, who was a forensic documents investigator, or as they call it, questioned documents. His job was taking various printed documents and in some way verifying its authenticity or figuring out examples of where it might have been forged or modified. As a result, his floor-to-ceiling library was filled with books about law enforcement, graphology, studying typewriters, studying the legal system, and all manner of company practices and office culture. The idea being that if he was brought in to look at a document, he would be able to know if a word was being used that didn't exist at the time, or that a printed document might have some sort of glyph on it that you would or wouldn't see at the time. He was, in other words, primarily helping to verify documents. But there was a lot more to that place than just some law enforcement information and a few books on how to do your job as an investigator. There were all sorts of file cabinets of fonts and typewriter manuals and design documents. And that's when Elaine told me that the contents of the entire office were going into storage, the trash, and other possible groups. At that point, I just said, "We're going to take it all. Anything you want to give to the Internet Archive, I'll take. Don't put any of it into storage, and don't feel you have to find anybody else it goes to." Elaine wasn't surprised that I made that sort of statement because she had been part of the manuals loadout back in 2015 when I walked into the warehouse of Manuals Plus, one of the largest collections of manuals in the country, and said, "We'll take everything we can." She had helped me move boxes of them around between storage areas and a coffee shop and a mall, so she knew large jobs didn't scare me. What she explained to me was that this was a combination of the work of Peter Tytell and of his parents, Martin and Pearl Tytell, who had run the Tytell Typewriter Company in New York City since the 1940s. It helped me understand what I was looking at, but at the time, I mostly focused on taking a few more boxes of magazines and telling her, we're definitely going to take this, just work out the details with me. When I got back to my car and started driving north, I looked up a little bit of information on the Tytell Typewriter Company, and what I discovered was that this was nothing short of a legacy. This was a family that had known typewriters, typewriting, and had had an immeasurable effect on the history of typewriters. Martin Tytell fixed and fabricated typewriters in the same way that Pavarotti sang or Picasso made art. He had been involved in all sorts of legal cases, had produced one-of-a-kind custom typewriters for a whole variety of purposes, including alternate languages, alternate ways of making the type work, and he had been the typewriter guy for so long that letters addressed to Mr. Typewriter, New York, and nothing else would show up at his office. This was a place that was repairing the Royals, the Underwoods, the Imperials, the Hermes of some of the most famous writers of history. The sign on his shop said psychoanalysis for your typewriter, and somebody like Andy Rooney might walk in asking for help in getting their typewriter working. Apparently, Martin could figure it out in moments whether or not the typewriter was salvageable, and it was very rarely not salvageable. In article after article that I could find, Martin Tytell loved typewriters. He loved everything about them. He thought they had a spirit, a character, a feeling built into them that expressed itself in the typewriter's mechanics. Nowadays, we'd throw a term in like guru or whisperer, but at the time he was just known as a master repair shop where typewriters were made and typewriter history was made as well. His wife, Pearl, had moved into what we would call forensic document examination, being able to work with folks who wanted to verify that the typewriter that it was claimed had written something was in fact the same typewriter. This could and did mean the difference between jail time and freedom, between monetary settlement and nothing. There was a case involving an island between two countries that was resolved based on typewriter authenticity. There were two widows of a writer fighting over an estate and trying to determine whether or not a written document was written before or after one of the marriages. There were cases like the Alger Hiss case, where Martin Tytell was able to prove that it was possible to forge a typewriter, to create a typewriter, and it took him 2 years, that would type in a way that was utterly indistinguishable from an original typewriter. This was a fundamentally fascinating history. When I got home, I figured, well, there's a chance this will happen, or it'll turn out that somebody will come along, recognize the inherent, obvious value in all of this, and take it over. Over the next few weeks, Elaine gave me updates as to how things were going, and she told me that Peter Tytell was initially skeptical that there would be anybody like us who would just take it all, and he was trying to figure out our motive. But then he figured out, oh, this is the Wayback People. And apparently that swayed him. 90% of it was going to go to the Internet Archive, and 10% of it to a questioned documents society who would get some very valuable materials that would become part of their library. Peter had already arranged and paid for all of the packing up, the moving, and the unpacking of this material. So it was just a matter of giving him a destination controlled by the Internet Archive. It probably won't surprise you to hear that we have a couple spaces we don't really talk about. But one of these was relatively close to where the movers had been paid to store things, and so we just told them, drive a little while longer and you'll have a place for them. At this moment, let me just mention, this is the kind of thing that doesn't happen often, but you have to be ready to move when it does. Finding out in seconds that you're going to go from having zero typewriter history to having one of the more important and unique typewriter and typewriter history collections can be a lot of whiplash if you're not prepared. Any hesitation, any feeling of being overwhelmed that I would have gotten from this was long ago wiped out by the Manuals Plus project, where we ended up with 1,600 banker boxes of manuals that we are going to be scanning. So I was ready for something of this size and complexity. I spent the next couple of weeks clearing my workspace, clearing my commitments, and arranging accommodations and travel. When the day came that the trucks pulled up, I was there. I mean, I wasn't there when they loaded out. I was still driving, but apparently it was about 45 minutes of work, and suddenly there were 18 pallets of boxes along with 130 typewriters. When I arrived, they were all there in the depot, and Elaine, Rachel, Frank, and myself began a 2-day process of rearranging what had come. This is a strange thing that I do, and I've seen myself do it a number of times. When I'm confronted with a very large amount of material, I almost immediately kick into this bizarre instinctual mode to sort and pre-sort and get things prepared. At the Kansas Fest events every year, I started to get into a mode where I would help them arrange all of the giveaway materials so that the maximum number of people could get to what they wanted as quickly as possible and get out of each other's way. You separate things by equipment type, by periodicals, by discs, and you put them in different corners of the room so that nobody has to bunch up to get anywhere. In the same way, we started to pull apart these boxes, and I started to come up with various ways of classifying sets of them. One set became straight-up books, just bound books ranging from the 1800s all the way up to the 2000s. Another group I called Not Books, Ephemera, which was manuals and brochures, flyers, all sorts of typewriter store stand-ups and catalogs, even material that I didn't know was there for any reason, like toy catalogs or unusual pictures and New York maps. There was a whole collection that we ended up calling Old Office. These were things like staplers and lights that there was absolutely nothing special about them. And frankly, my current plan is to give them to an antiques dealer. Then came a group that we ended up calling the Golden Pallets. These were items that Elaine thought were precious enough that they should be prioritized and put into digitization because they would have an actual long-term effect on forensics and typewriter history. What these were the original design documents for the Underwood and Imperial typewriter companies, the actual hand drawings of all the designs of the typefaces and parts of the equipment, literally hand-drawn blueprints of typewriters. Even collections of typed text where they would take a production run and type out all of the letters and then provide them with a card explaining where the letters had come from. This is unquestionably within the realm of typewriters, pure, solid gold. So we put them in the golden pallets, of which we ended up with 2.5. Finally, there were the typewriters. We looked through a few of them to see how they were packed. They were packed fine, and we took photos of some of them, including typewriters that typed in Hebrew and Arabic, and beautiful specimens from all through the 20th century that the family had obviously thought were very special. I blogged about it, I shared it with my coworkers, and we packed them away so that they could be stored until I make my way down there again. So what's next? Let's talk about two different things. It's unquestioned that the books will be scanned. They are, in many cases, extremely unique and unusual subjects that otherwise have no more sold copies and are completely impossible to find. The Tytels kept them around for decades, and they really deserve to be preserved as well as possible. There's a whole range of brochures and manuals that are incredibly beautiful, so I expect to have them scanned sooner rather than later. The typewriters, well, it really wasn't the goal of the Internet Archive to be the kind of place that held equipment. This is why there isn't a shipping container full of 8-bit machines, because the amount of people who wanted to send me machines has been huge over the decade. And I could have easily taken it all, but instead redirected it to places that I thought would take care of it. By the way, I feel as a minor public service announcement, you should make sure that any system you're storing doesn't have batteries in it, because a lot of batteries are exploding after decades of being ignored, and that's something you really have to deal with. Check your machine for batteries. But we weren't in the machine business at the archive until now. Now we've got dozens and dozens of beautiful typewriters. This has become one of my projects to pair the typewriters up with institutions and individuals who will be lent many of them so that the machines are both used and maintained. Some of them probably will become trophies, things we display under some sort of circumstance. In other cases, I don't know. This is entirely new territory for me. I've never been a typewriter caretaker before, and the Internet Archive has never been in this business. But it was easier for everybody involved to just say yes to everything that the Tytels had, instead of playing games and saying we only wanted one piece or another. It's going to be a fantastic time trying to figure out what I'm doing with all this material. And again, when I walked into that building to take a few magazines, I did not know that I would be walking out with 2 truckloads of the history of the Tytel Typewriter Company. But the difference between success and failure, achieving and not achieving, is being willing to turn on a dime, to be able to understand that the circumstances you were promised have changed. And if you're not prepared to pivot, to stretch, to take on more than you expected, a lot of chances in life are going to slip away. Another unexpected aspect of this is that this has sent me and the Internet Archive hurling into the typewriter culture. The people who collect and maintain, discuss, argue, pontificate on typewriters, their cultural meaning, their current use, their future. It's been quite a lot of work to research everything going on right now, to kind of overlay all of the different roles that I know are in a culture, the people everyone trusts, the folks who are making the most moves, what sort of controversies or concerns exist, and of course, whether or not what you are doing is something they'll accept or reject. As it stands, Peter Tytel was a giant in this group. Everybody seems to have a story of talking with him, being taught by him, interacting with him. He was an active person in this culture. People were devastated when they found out that Peter Tytel was dying. Peter Tytel had terminal lung cancer and spent 2020 fighting it and yielding to it. By the time the 2 truckloads of typewriter history, of Tytel family history, was making it to our facility, Peter Tytel had been gone for over a week. His last interactions with people involved making sure that this legacy was safe, that it was going somewhere, that it would have some sort of meaning. Elaine told me that he had wavered over time whether to keep any of it or maybe the time was past. But he knew, before he was gone, that at least one institution was going to go through it all, to respectfully go through it, process it, make it a part of the world, make it something that would reach a lot of people and hopefully honor the family name. As I face down pallets of history, printed works, and machinery from a time past, it's going to be a real challenge, but also exactly why I'm here. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It. Thanks to Emilio Oliveira, Wayne Arthurton, Scott Roseanne, Scott McGrady, Forrest Fuqua, Mark Pilgrim, and James Bekoyanu, along with the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. While this story has a happy ending, it comes at the price of losing somebody very unique and very special. And unfortunately, as we're looking forward, institutions are closing down, libraries are ending, companies are going under, and that means a lot of history is at risk. A lot of the built-up, curated, created archives are going to be lost. With luck, some percentage of them, some amount, will end up in the hands of people willing to turn around and provide a truck, a pallet jack, and storage space. But I hope that anybody out there listening to this going forward feels entirely free, completely invited to alert me to things they've heard of. I'd rather hear 20 times over about something than to never hear it. There are resources and archives of incalculable uniqueness and history that perhaps need one email, one phone call to keep them from oblivion. Please feel free to be that phone call and that email.